This is John O'Sullivan speaking from Budapest, the Danube Institute there. And this is the second of three programs about the first, the first round was last Friday. We'll analyze the first round's results and make some suggestions about the second. Finally, next Tuesday, we will have an analysis of the entire process. We have three distinguished commentators. First of all, we have Elizabeth Moutet, the Paris correspondent of the London Sunday Telegraph. Think of her, namely the main interpreter of French politics to the conservative half of the English-speaking world. Daniel Mahoney, distinguished American political philosopher who specializes in political theorists of the right, but not only of the right, is also a specialist in Vatican politics and the political Catholic Church. And finally, we have Esther Seuss, who is here in Hungary and is one of the principal people who interpret French politics and French ideas to the people. I'm delighted to have all three of you here. And my first question to Anne-Elizabeth is to just tell us quickly what, let me in a sense narrow it down. It's my impression that the results that were revealed in the first round showed a strong performance by the Rassemblement National, but one that probably fell short of their expectations. And what does it mean for their about what the likelihood of their being able to form a government after the second round? Elizabeth.
They did well. The National Rally did very well in the election, but they did not reach the heights where the polls saw them. They are usually counted, including that splinter of Républicain Party who decided to go with them, to ally themselves. And even though they are Républicains à droite and not Rassemblement National, they have their posters when they campaign have got both the candidate and Jordan Bardella and sometimes Éric Ciotti, the president of the Républicain, who decided to follow the National Rally, and all the others decided, the grandees decided that no, it was the red line and they couldn't do it. But he's bringing in 3.5% to 4% votes, and that's really important. They got 33.3%. This is more than was expected. This is not more, this is less than was expected. This is, therefore, they are in positions of sort of weakness if there is in any of those elections where you've got three candidates in the second round. And to remind people, the first round, you have as many candidates as want to try it out. And the second round, nobody can be present if, unless someone has got more than 50%, in which case they are elected in the first round. But other than that, which is mostly not the case, you need to have to have received a 12.5% votes of the number of registered voters, not actual voters. And in many constituencies, 306. This is falling fast because there are alliances. This means that you had a second round, and the National Rally person was first in most of those. But the National Rally person, depending on whether there would be three candidates or two candidates, could win or lose. And Emmanuel Macron, having abused the New Popular Front, and especially that part of it which is Marxist and anti-Semitic and populist and anti-French, and all of this is Macron himself saying this at a press conference, now says that there has to be a Front Républicain, and everybody's got to align themselves to prevent the National Rally from getting in. And that means supporting the people he abused 3 weeks ago, because that is the way of Macron. So the result of this is that the National Rally will do well, but it doesn't look as if it can have a full majority. And we know that Jordan Bardella said, I do not want to be prime minister unless I have a full majority in the House, and it's got to be 288 MPs. And now there is an understanding that if they are short 10 or 15 MPs, he might still go there because he feels that he will find on the Republican right enough people to vote his bills. He will be in a better position still than Macron is now, that he lost his complete majority himself at the elections of 2022, and he might try it. But my feeling now is really that you have two blocks. You will have two blocks, and it's the voters that are going to make the difference, because most people do not want to be the people who said no. Most candidates, most parties do not want to be the party that says vote for the National Rally. Nobody says vote for the National Rally. They are still beyond the pale. The Républicains themselves, most of them, and not all, have said you can vote for anyone you like, but we are not the extremes, which meant the National Rally and La France Insoumise, France Unbold, the Jean-Luc Mélenchon party. But all of this is vague. I mean, and Macron is looking like the cat who got the cream at the 11th hour, if I can mix my metaphors, and is saying, you see, everything is proceeding as I planned. It isn't, but that's the way he does it.
Thank you very much. Now, I'm going on to Daniel here, and obviously you may want to respond to Anne-Elizabeth, but also I'm mood of the right that isn't Rassemblement National, because yet again, what you see is the leader, those legacy parties on the right, in France, as in several other countries now, they're going to join with the socialists, the Greens, and the Liberals to keep the right out. I wonder how long that particular game can be played. But over to you.
Well, I think there's a split in the Républicains between the Grandes that Anne-Elizabeth referred to, who are really repeating a kind of rhetoric and a mode of thought appropriate to 10 or 20, 30 years ago, who identify the National Rally in its present form with what Alan Finkielkraut has called the brown plague. I don't think it's very compelling or convincing at this point in time. I think the rank and file, or many of the rank and file in Les Républicains, if they have to choose between a grand Republican coalition that includes France Insoumise, whose dominating elements are not only Marxist and anti-Semitic and anti-French, anti-patriotic, as Anne-Elizabeth said so well, but is also Leninist. We saw the reaction to the first round of the election. It's very hard to have an anti-National Rally coalition when the heart and soul of the new Popular Front has revealed itself to be lawless and openly crazy in a full-scale ideological sense. I think for Republican voters and for many voters probably in Macron's centrist coalition, deep down they fear the new Popular Front in power more than they feel the National Rally. So the rhetoric is still imprisoned by old categories and, this Republican arc that will embargo any participation of the National Rally in French national life. But I think in the coming week, as people decide, I think certainly the base of Les Républicains are going to lean strongly to National Rally, and I think even centrist voters would have to admit deep down that the victory of the new Popular Front would be eminently more radical than the victory of National Rally. I mean, one of the remarkable things is all the efforts of the more moderate leftist parties to distance themselves from France Insoumise and Mélenchon's aggressive ideological leftism went up in smoke when they formed this coalition whose heart and soul is dominated by the hard ideological left. So it's very hard. We're at a moment right now where predictions are very difficult to make. But I just don't think the old routine, of scaring the public about imminent fascism, incipient fascism, and all of that, I just don't think it's working. And I think it'll continue to work less and less. And I don't think it really matters what Macron says anymore. He's discredited. He looks foolish. His the idea he conveys that he can control and anticipate events, that he can block the extremes and all of it, it's all become rather irrelevant. So I just think France has entered a new moment in its national history. I think it's essentially the case that Marine Le Pen and the people around her have succeeded in largely diabolizing, as the French say, the National Rally. It's not Jean-Marie Le Pen's party. It's pro-Israel. It's anti-Semitic. It's against Europe behemoth. It's they've modified their positions on things like Ukraine. And I just don't think they're very scary to, I think Insoumise and the hard left is infinitely more revolutionary and anti-Republican. And I think
thank you.
People will see that.
Yeah, good. Thank you. Now, obviously, Esther, you may want to respond to the two previous speakers, but I'd like to just also throw in to your lap the question. It does look at the moment as though the big of the election has been Emmanuel Macron. First of all, is that your view? Secondly, what do you think he can do to prevent himself being in a more profound sense in the next couple of years?
Let me start with your last question, because I think that's the big picture that we can take away from today's discussion. So I think we can safely say that Macron is weakened by this election. That's one thing. The second thing is that the way of government, the way of governing in France, whatever happens this Sunday is going to change. So there are two main scenarios that we can identify at this moment. One is a political government with the National Rally's absolute majority, so the 289 MPs, or a political government where the National Rally doesn't have the absolute majority, but is able to convince other right-wing members of parliament to vote crucial legislation. So this is one scenario. In this scenario, we are talking about a classical cohabitation between a president from one party and between a prime minister from another party. It has happened 3 times in French history, in modern history, so they have a traditional way of doing things, but I expect, based on the electoral debates, that there will be renewed debates about the power, the separation of power, if you will, between the president and the prime minister and the government. So this is one scenario, and obviously Macron will be able to do less in this case than before. The other is perhaps a little bit easier for Emmanuel Macron. That would be a parliament that is split, a hung parliament where there is no obvious majority. In this case, he would be able to nominate a government, a prime minister to his liking, but that government would be obligated to negotiate every single piece of legislation, the budget and everything. And this government would be submitted to the whims of parliament. That means that it could be very similar to the Fourth Republic, when governments fell very frequently. In 11 years, they had 22 governments, so it was very unstable. And Macron wouldn't be able to respond to this instability because, according to the constitution, he cannot dissolve the National Assembly until summer 2025. So whatever happens, he wouldn't be able to continue the way he has governed before. And it means that he would have to negotiate much more, and the center of power, whatever happens, would go to the National Assembly or to the government, and he would be one of the power players, but not necessarily the main power player. So if you will, from a tactical point of view, yes, he is absolutely weakened, but there is a strategic point of view that I would like to raise, and that is the political use of cohabitation. In French political history, we have learned that presidents usually use cohabitation well to their advantage. It means that difficult decisions are usually taken by the government. The unpopularity curse, if you will, touches rather the government, and presidents tend to use this situation well to their advantage. So I think that Macron might have a strategic consideration which says that, okay, we are going to enter into a cohabitation, and let's see how the National Rally uses up its popularity. And I think that the fact that Jordan Bardella is going to enter Matignon and not Marine Le Pen is something that suggests that the National Rally knows this, so they are going to act accordingly.
Thank you very much. Now, I'd like to go in the reverse order. So I'm asking you the next question as well, Esther. About the kind of policies that a National Front government, National Rassemblement government might carry out. The reason I mention this is today, Nigel Farage, who has been admired of the way in which Marine Le Pen has taken her party from fever swamps into the mainstream by abandoning any patriotism and adopting a completely democratic outlook. He's praised, but he's very critical of her economic policies. He's sounding questionable in what he says there, because he is essentially saying you cannot vast spending program on the basis of borrowing and expect to come. I think that represents the markets in a way, doesn't it? Do you regard this weakness on the part of the National Rassemblement?
So in order for us to understand why the platform of the National Rally is the way it is for us to understand that Marine Le Pen thought about building an electoral coalition that is not a classical right-wing coalition. So she is thinking about an elite bloc and a popular bloc. So this is a different cleavage than the classical left-right cleavage. And her policies from an economic point of view are very social-oriented and etatist, if you will. So the state is at the center of it. And I think part of the French right is traditionally etatist. So it's not necessarily a weird example in France. I think it's normal Bonapartism, Gaullism. So traditional right-wing parties are often etatist. But she wanted to create an electoral coalition where she can talk to electors who would be or could be also left-wing electors because of social issues. So that's how she created the program, which focuses on two main messages, I think: security and social security. And if you take a look at previous presidential elections like 2002 or 2007, they were all won on the issue of security. And 2012 was won on the issue of the economy and social solidarity. So she managed to put these two things together that traditionally, historically, speaks well to the French electorate. So this is the political context of the National Rally's economic platform. Now, during this electoral campaign, it was very visible that the social part of this platform needed some adjustment, if you will. For example, there is the widely unpopular pension reform that was introduced by President Macron these last 2 years. And traditionally, both the left and the right, so the National Rally also says that they want to undo it. So go back to the previous retirement age of 62 and ultimately 60. And for example, at the beginning of this campaign, Jordan Bardella started by saying that it's not a priority. And then he walked back on his opinion and said that, yeah, we are going to do it anyway. He talks about reducing the VAT tax. He also talks about reducing the income tax for people under 30. And all these promises obviously create debates with political opponents. And one of the problems of the National Rally is the obvious situation of the French budget. 2 weeks ago, the European Commission, for example, said that they want to push back France under the excessive deficit procedure. If you remember, in the last decade, France managed to come out of this procedure. It was hard work on behalf of governments to get out of this procedure, and now they are under the threat of getting back to it. And obviously, when you are under this procedure, your press, if you will, your image among the economic elite deteriorates, and that can raise costs for the budget. So it's not necessarily an advantageous place to be. So the National Rally has to adjust its wishes, the program, the political message, and the economic realities. And one of the solutions that they proposed is a budget audit, which would kind of take a look at what's going on, where the money is, what is spent, what is not spent. But the French press rightly says that it is very rare that such audits find extra money. Usually they find spending. So it can be a political justification, for creating an order for delivering the program. So they can say that, okay, we did this audit. This is how it looks like. And this is what we can do right now. This is what is possible. And this is what we want to do and will do, but we are going to do it later. So I think that there will be a political process where they kind of reframe the economic situation, and they are going to blame it on the previous centrist governments, and they are going to create an order of doing things, and they are going to communicate it if they are in government.
Thank you. Now let me turn to Daniel and take an aspect Esther has just said, namely the new government's relationship with Europe and with Brussels, and ask this question. The general view, people were weeping into their cassis at Brussels as the news came in. But the fact is that, despite the fact that Marine Le Pen has moderated her position, she's not leave Europe or anything like that. Nonetheless, they must be looking at the map of Europe, saying to themselves, Italy now has a Eurosceptic prime. France looks like getting one in the next week. There is one. There's always been one, actually, in Denmark, in Copenhagen, because all government of the left, it's a government which has opted out of a great many of the rules and regulations of Brussels. So how are you going to respond, in your view, to this new Europe? They are themselves no longer, so to speak, the democrat who determines everything, but are going to be in some kind of debate with member governments in which they no longer, so to speak, can wield the truncheon, but have to negotiate.
Yeah, it's one thing when Euro elites are pushing Poland around when it's governed by law and justice, or treat Prime Minister Orban and Fidesz with complete contempt, and up the ante in terms of political rhetoric that denounces Eurosceptical countries with more enhanced patriotic and religious traditions, denounce them as illiberal, anti-democratic, un-European. It's a little harder to do that with Italy or France, controlled by Eurosceptics. I would say this too. Yes, I think Marine Le Pen and Jordan Bardella have figured out that a more effective way of changing Europe and changing France's relationship to Europe is not to simply denounce the European project and not simply to leave it, but to reorient it in fundamental ways. And there's a French tradition there. I mean, Think back to de Gaulle's great press conferences in the early 60s. He said, Dante spoke Italian, Chateaubriand spoke French, Goethe spoke German, even Shakespeare spoke English. They did not speak Volapük or Esperanto. Now in practice, despite de Gaulle's defense of the L'Europe des Patries and all of that, France drifted along, along with the you might say, the vision of Europe that had been pioneered by Schumann and somebody like Jean Monnet in France. But one thing I think people miss is that look at all these patriotic and Eurosceptical political parties and groupings in Europe today. They form a kind of European international. They are not marked by that kind of nasty nationalism that sees every neighboring country is an enemy. They're in it together. And they see, I think, the beginning of the prospects of a kind of common project to reorient the European Union. And so I think that's important. Look, I think as the Eurosceptical right becomes more influential, as it starts to win or at least be a visible and viable electoral presence in many European countries, I think the attitude that the EPP recently adopted, again, we're going to form a common front with our political enemies to keep the far right out with intimations of Mussolini and Hitler and Vichy and all that. It's just no longer, as I said in my earlier remarks, it's not really believable anymore. And I do think there are elements in the establishment right, the Republican in France, some of the Christian Democrats in Europe, who, truth be told, feel rather sympathetic to some of the complaints. They would do it in a more tepid, they would express their concerns in a more tepid, reformist, moderate way. But I think, I just don't think the European community can do to France or Italy what it did to Poland, for example. Donald Tusk, I think I mentioned last time, recently got a democracy award from Brussels. I mean, how ludicrous given political developments in Poland today. I just want to say one thing about in response to the previous remarks about political economy and the Front National. I think there is a prospect for some liberal elements that was very nicely brought out in the previous remarks, especially against the sort of concentrations of power and regulation imposed by Brussels. But I do think Anglo-American commentators and politicians have to resign ourselves to the fact, Tocqueville's very helpful here, France is a much more administered state and society than the Anglo-Saxon world and will always be. And so French conservatism will always be rather more statist. But one historical example might be helpful here. De Gaulle often spoke about worker labor participation, critiqued the excesses of capitalism. And I think he meant that. He was worried about mass society. But the first thing he did when he came in 1958, he turned to Jacques Rueff and his anti-inflation policy. He turned to a classical liberal who was a member of the Montpellier Society to provide broad direction on monetary policy, anti-inflation policy, while still being quite French in his attitude to the état-providence. And one last comment, there's the état-providence of the traditional right, statist, but not socialist, and there's the état-providence of the left, which wants, remember Mitterrand in 81, it's a word I cannot say in French because I can't use. La rupture, the rupture. They want a complete rupture with the liberal order, with the capitalist political economy. The National Rally doesn't want that.
I would like to say at this stage that I was lucky enough to meet Rueff just after Mitterrand had been elected. And that Rueff was very happy that Mitterrand was elected and he welcomed the suck the rich taxes. So not too Montpellier either.
No.
Oh,
Let me,
he supported the Front Populaire in 81?
It was not a Front Populaire. There's only one Front Populaire. The
Oh,
people.
l'Union la Gauche, l'Union la Gauche.
L'Union de la Gauche, yeah. I mean, I'm smarting from the fact that Mélenchon and his acolytes have usurped the title of what was really a great real anti-fascist movement in 1936 in France under Léon Blum. That was a rather different sort of thing. But no, I was amazed. I mean, Rueff said, no, I don't care. It is very good. And he had taken me to lunch, and he superbly tore up the lunch bill to said, I do not believe in expense accounts, which to the fledgling baby journalist I was what?
okay.
And Elizabeth, I want to suggest he was wiser in 58 than in 81, but who knows?
Probably.
I want to put two names, Elizabeth. One is the name of Keir Starmer. So
Yes.
it's more or less certain that on Friday morning he'll be prime minister. He who thinks of himself as a strong pro-European, almost a Europhiliac, in fact. And he is somebody who has made it plain he wants, insofar as possible, overturning Brexit formally to overturn it in 1,000 minor ways. Now he is coming to power as a candidate of Europe, when in Europe there are second thoughts on some of these. He's also in power as the man who believes in who believes in taking on the kind of feeble conservative accommodations to leftism and applying them very toughly. I mean, he's for net zero. He's for gender theory. He's an open borders man or something near it. Now, those are the things probably losing the Tories the election massively, and yet he's coming in as the candidate of those policies, and at the same time, those policies reconsidered. Let me put it politely in Europe. The second name. So, please, your view on how Starmer is going to work with Europe, and secondly, what about the leader of the Christian Democrats? Because he's really the unelected leader of the EPP, if we really think of
you mean?
The Merch, yes, exactly.
Yes.
Fritz.
Yeah.
He, it seems to me, is in a very important position. Turn the Christian Democrats a bit more to the right, and that changes the balance of power in Europe as a whole. If most, it doesn't have to have all of the EPP, if most of the EPP goes along with that, what do you think he's likely to do?
These are several things at once, and you broke up at one stage because I didn't hear what you wanted to say, what you were saying actually about Keir Starmer, saying, he does something that I didn't hear, and then he picks those policies like net zero, etc. What was that? What was the but before that you said?
I'm sorry, I didn't catch what you said there.
Okay, when you were asking the question about Keir Starmer, you says he takes policies, and then there was a blank, and he takes those policies such as net zero, such as open.
Yes, that's right. He's to the policies that the Tory party is going to lose the election because it adopted. So, in other words, the centrism of British politics has been to be in favour of easy migration, to be in favour of theory, more or less. That's been changing lately, but only lately. The net and a strong climate policy. I did mention another one, I forget. Now,
no, but what you meant to say, because really it's breaking up, what you're meant to say is that centrism in Britain has veered left.
Yeah.
Okay.
And it's being defeated. Triumph in Britain on Thursday. If you see what I mean.
It's been.
What you have in Britain.
John, I don't hear you.
Oh, sorry. Okay.
It's been defeated something in Britain on Thursday.
Can I interpret, because I can hear everything? I think John is saying that the Tories are going to be punished for their unqualified fidelity to this fake centrism, including transgender ideology. And yet the electoral result is that Labor's coming in with a much more aggressive commitment to all of these policies. And he's wondering, I think your comment on that, but also how this is going to affect Britain's relationship to Europe precisely in a moment when the public is rethinking the European project in its present form. Did I get that right, John?
Okay.
Perfect. You should be my editor every time.
So, several things here. First of all, and it's a massive if. All of this, if we look at this in the French prism, you have to realize that the French are almost completely unaware of either British or German policies and in domestic politics, and actually in Germany, they know nothing about it. If you took a French person in the street, I don't think there would be 1 out of 10 who would tell you which party Olaf Scholz is. And it might not have been the same with Angela Merkel, but I'm not raising my hopes very high. And in Britain, they understand more or less that the guy who's being kicked out is a conservative, but that's all they know. And it's so the interaction of French politics with foreign politics is limited. It's also limited because, as I said last time, the French are completely they don't read in foreign languages, most of them. I mean, the scientists, yet, the think tankers, definitely, some of the journalists now, yes. Politicians, almost not. The British election, I don't want to have too many opinions on British elections because I'm not as often in London. I think what you asked about, how strange that the Tories are reacting in a way where people resent their centrism and then they're going to vote for left centrism. In fact, until he spoke about Ukraine and possibly even beyond, Nigel Farage was being the sort of Trump type disruptor on the left. And whoever in Britain in politics is dissatisfied with the current Tories says, fine, let's have the red guy with the turquoise rosette and vote for Nige. And I think the British, unlike the French, feel very strongly about Ukraine for many reasons. One is they remember World War II and the Blitz, and they know what it's like when you're being sort of pummeled by bombs by another country. And the other one is that Russia has waged a secret war that included poisoning and killings in Britain, including the risk of poisoning an entire neighborhood in Salisbury. And the result is that it is perfectly understood in the British psyche that Russia is against Britain in ways that the French don't say. There's a great deal about French-Russian friendship in France that has been fostered and paid for by Russia. The many think tanks which, where they invite people in Russia and they tell the French that we were brothers in arms during the Great Patriotic War and we respected the soldiers of Napoleon. And there's an entire institute of French-Russian history set up by Putin with an interesting character who was a parliamentary assistant for Jean-Marie Le Pen for a bit. And he set up that institute and they organized great ceremonies. One was on the Battle of Borodino. They managed to find the remains of a French general, General Gudin, and to say this was a brave French general, and we must return this in majesty. And they returned this to the French military and the French state. There was a burial of General Gudin with a ceremony at the Invalides. And it was a wonderful piece of historical and diplomacy for Vladimir Putin. And they did this again in Crimea, in the battlefronts of the Crimean War, 1850s. And I was contacted by this guy, Pierre Malinowski, and he said, would you like to come to Crimea? And I had Ukrainian friends, and I said, should I? And they said, you really should not. And and that was before the war, of course. And I said, okay, I will ask more questions. And then a French politician who now will be elected and is in the national rally of Marine Le Pen, Thierry Mariani, who has hosted in great splendor something called Dialogue France-Russie, and who's a Russian shill and who has traveled many times to occupied Crimea, explaining that this was really Russia, with as many French MPs he could garner. Was involved in this, and then I didn't go. But that is the entire effort is something that we ought to pay attention to. So we have very different ways of assessing foreign policy. And this is why I think, there will be things that the French and the British will have in common. I think mostly the French military and the British military will have something in common because they are comparable. They're comparable in size. They're comparable in capacity of deployment. And until recently, deployed in very different areas. We used to deploy in Africa. We now are in bad terms in Africa, partly because of our nice friends, the Russians. Britain deployed in other places, but there was the Treaty of Saint-Malo, there was a Treaty of Lancaster Gate. That's something in which whoever becomes president, this is something that's going to remain. But other than that, France and Britain have been at loggerheads on Brexit because both countries have used a sort of populist contempt of the other to essentially make themselves look good. Which is no way to found policies, and that's the best I can say. If Starmer sort of goes to Macron, assuming he's still there, and says we would like to reverse Brexit, Macron is going to be divided in two things that I would rate more or less equally, and that would be do I keep on telling the Brits that divorces have consequences and keep sucking it to the Brits because the French were encouraging Brussels to make it extra painful for Britain to leave Europe? Or does he say this is the opportunity of somebody of the moderate left to sort of organize something in which we might have better relations? And quite honestly, Macron being Macron, I have absolutely no clue what he would choose.
Thank you very much. Now I want to turn where I'm watching the clock here, so I have get questions answered quickly, and then I've got one question I'm addressing to you all. I would like a quick answer to that. Now, Daniel, if I turn back to you, I'm also not only to you but to your specialty. You are a specialist in philosophy and particularly of the right. Now, what must be clear is the intellectual bankruptcy of the traditional French right at the moment. That seems to be the case anyway. And perhaps there's similar bankruptcies on the left and the center. But nonetheless, from in your world, this is extremely. And I'm wondering, when you look at the new focus of parties, this party has got quite a lot of left-wing elements in it. And secondly, decaying and apparently self-consciously bankrupt traditions, the Gaullists. Who are the intellectuals and politicians, but more, what are the ideas that are going to animate this group to restore the right in future? Over to you.
Well, I don't think there's a serious intellectual underpinning for what the National Rally represents. That's not to say there aren't some French political thinkers who are interested in a more self-conscious and articulate defense of the nation, who are worried about Islamicization and all that. But the French right today, the intellectual right, if we leave out the Nouvelle Droite and people on the edge like Hélène Benoit and all that, these they're kind of liberal conservatives who and a tradition I feel very close to, who Tocquevillians, who want who are not afraid to speak about the nation and the moral undercurrents of a decent and free society, but at the same time don't reject the liberal order per se or anything of the sort. I do think too many um, French conservative liberals after the fall of communism just sort of accept it. A magazine I've written for many times, Commentaire, edited by Jean-Claude Casanova, it's so Europeanist, it's so centrist, it's so Macronist, it's open to different currents. But, Raymond Aron was a much tougher thinker. He was worried about the decadence of the West. He was worried about the decline in civic and military virtue. He was much more courageous in standing up to the left. And some of these Iranians they're just, stuck in the middle in a way that is a little blind, a little just really refusing to see where the threats are coming to today, not only to the integrity of the French nation, but to liberal civilization. My friend Pierre Menant recently published an article in a French Catholic magazine, traditional Catholic magazine called La Nef, where he said, we've got to ask ourselves, is this present order with wokeness, with our woke imperium, spreading transgenderism about the world, with the animus against the nation, with, more elites more sympathetic to Islam than they are to the Christian patrimony of Europe. Is this a liberal order in any recognizable sense? My complaint about the French centrists, people who were pretty good during the Cold War and anti-communists and all that, is they think they're defending liberalism, but this new order that is linked, you might say, to the European project in its present form it erodes self-government, it erodes national self-affirmation, it erodes political common sense. It's far an issue, Anne Elizabeth and I talked about last time, far too technocratic and soulless. And yet they see themselves in a very pharisaical and self-righteous way as the defenders of moderation. Now, I will say there's some interesting, I like Causeur, which is a sort of liberal conservative magazine that isn't afraid to stand up to political correctness. I sometimes find interesting things in Incorrect, although I think they lean more toward the national rally and national right but they certainly highlight some excellent French thinkers. There are some independent French thinkers like Alain Finkielkraut, who's an old 68er, Jewish thinker turned sort of a French Orwell, very critical of the totalitarian currents of the left. There are good people in France, but I think part of the center-right intellectual class, like the center-right political class, if I can use a word, is petrified. They're petrified of extremists,
Okay.
but they're petrified.
I recognize that stage. Yes.
Yes, that
you.
petrification where they just can't see things clearly. They're stuck.
No, thank you. Now, Esther, you may just want to comment quickly on that, but the question, which is perhaps a little unfair since we don't know much about this, but have any impression of how the recent election results and the current discussions in France are having in Hungary, on Hungary, to, of course, the future of Europe and those kind of questions, but other questions too, perhaps?
First of all, let me address the issue of the right in France, because I also think it's very important and very interesting. My thesis is that not only for the French right, but for the whole political elite and maybe intellectual elite, Gaullism has become a very important point of departure. But we are talking about many different interpretations of Gaullism. It means that everybody refers back to the concepts of Charles de Gaulle, to his practices, to his ideas, but they differ on how it should be applied for the present and what kind of action derives from their analysis. So my analysis is that you cannot understand contemporary France without understanding Gaullism and the different currents of Gaullism and the different possible interpretations. If you take a look at Emmanuel Macron, he's going to refer to the general the same way as Marine Le Pen, and even left-wing sovereignists are going to invoke the name of the General de Gaulle at one or another moment in time. So the reason why the French right and the French center is very interesting right now is that the political surface, the party structure is changing. Obviously, the National Rally is trying to occupy the space of Bonapartism and Gaullism. So this is what they are doing when they go under the Republican umbrella and they begin to refer to Gaullism much more than before. Remember that the National Front historically is an anti-Gaullist party when it is when it is founded. So it is a very interesting development. And what I'm interested in is to see whether, the thesis of the French rights, which says that there are three types of right-wing groups in France: the liberal Orleanist one, the Bonapartist one, and the revolutionary one, whether this historic structure is going to be recreated or it's going to be reorganized, perhaps with other actors than before. So whether we are going to see the long-term structures and currents being recreated. And when it happens, when we see, or if we see that there's a stable party structure, because the party structure right now is so much in movement that it's very difficult to, analyze who's who and who's where, then we are going to be able to do a deeper ideological analysis and see how it fits with historic French patterns. And a few words on Europe, if you allow me, if we still have time. It's going to be very, very interesting because the outcome of the election is going to have an impact on France's European policies. Because if Macron is able to nominate a government to his liking, then his ministers are going to participate in council formations in Brussels. If it's a political government with the National Rally, then National Rally politicians are going to participate in council formations in Brussels. And it's going to obviously result in different policy outcomes for France. And even with a split and a hung parliament, it's going to be much more difficult for Macron to carry out his own will in Europe. Now, I refer back to my earlier thesis on the different interpretations of Gaullism. It's going to be very interesting because here two types of French souveranisms are going to compete for attention in Brussels. The Macron type souveranism, which talks much more about European level policies, and the national type of souveranism of the National Rally. It's going to be very interesting if it happens in cohabitation. The thing is that whatever happens, and that's going to be my conclusion here, the voice of France is going to be a little bit weaker than before for two reasons. First of all, because whatever happens in the European Council, so the Council of Prime Ministers and Presidents, Macron is going to be weaker because the ratification skills of his are going to be weaker, because either he's going to have a cohabitation or a hung parliament, and that makes things much more difficult. So whatever happens, his situation is going to be much more difficult. And let me draw your attention to another fact. If France is in difficulty, parallelly, we can take a look at Germany. We know that the German model, the German economy, and the German coalition has its problems of their own. So we can see that the two main actors of the European Union, the participants of this famous engine, this motor of the European Union, are both in a difficult situation for different reasons, of course. And I think that such a situation might open, interesting games for the peripheric members of the European Union in Central Eastern Europe or even Southern Europe with Spain and Italy. So the balance of power in the European Union might change a little bit, and that's going to be very interesting. Now, what remains to be seen, and I have my doubts on that, whether, while having the two biggest countries of the European Union, or the governments or the power structures of these countries being in a more difficult or weakened state, whether it can, strengthen the whole European Union as a whole, as the geopolitical actor. That's another question that remains to be seen. Obviously, I hope it's very visible based on our discussion today that the French practice of government, the French decision-making practice is going to be much more difficult and much more interesting to watch for us analysts. And we are going to be watching like a hawk to see whether it, whether they can find a good practice, a good institutional order that can nevertheless come out with effective decisions. That remains to be seen, but that's the big question of the next 12 months.
John, could I say something very briefly?
I'm going to give one last chance to say something,
okay,
which actually is going to start with Esther and then you, Elizabeth. And it's a very simple question, and but it's an interesting one. Most of you, and maybe it's not true of Esther, know of John Gray, the English intellectual, somebody who has traversed the entire spectrum at different times, but who is regarded by many Brits, and I'm one really, as a kind of a figure, somebody who may get things wrong, but who is intellectually all interesting, and I think on the whole, correct things. Not always. Now, in a short 800-word article, he was trying to sum up was the battle going on throughout Europe. And he said it all comes down to between national democracy and global technocracy. The technocrats are currently in charge, but as some of these election results show, the grip is loosening on power, and the advocates of national democracy are advancing, perhaps not always as much as they hoped, but do. So my question is, that's John's definition of European politics today. In all our countries, there are different stages of this battle going on. Esther, could you begin by responding to what he said? And then I'm going to ask Daniel and Elizabeth to do the same.
I hope I understood correctly what you just said, but I'm pretty sure I have, so I'm going to start from there. I think what he's talking about is this famous global-local cleavage. So we've been talking a lot about not only European politics, but also American politics and UK politics, saying that the traditional, the after-war right-wing cleavage is, if it's not replaced, but parallelly, it is accompanied by a global local cleavage. And in France, it has been a development of political life for the last 30 years that this classical right-wing cleavage has been, by 2017, replaced by this global local cleavage. But by replaced, I mean that it has been dominant, this global local cleavage on a national level, because obviously, in this sense, Emmanuel Macron and Marine Le Pen are their best enemies in representing these two poles. But there are other actors like the Socialist Party or the Republicans who are very much interested in reviving the old left-wing, right-wing cleavage, because they feel more comfortable on this cleavage simply because on the global local level they are split. So if you take a look at what's going on with the Republicans, I think it's an example of this split. Half of them are more comfortable on the global side of the cleavage, and the good part of them are more comfortable on the local side of the cleavage. And by the way, Emmanuel Macron and Marine Le Pen cooperated in taking apart these classical government parties, the Socialists and the Republicans. So it's in their common interest to keep this global local cleavage alive. Interestingly, in this sense, the loss of Macron in the National Assembly elections are not necessarily a good news long-term for Marine Le Pen, because she needs Emmanuel Macron as a counterpoint to be her opponent. So it's much more comfortable for the National Rally to organize political life on this global local cleavage and not with a left or right-wing party. So I think that this is something to watch out for. This is something that's going on in many, many countries. Partly Brexit is often explained by this phenomenon. The Trump phenomenon, the American political life is often explained with this phenomenon. So I think that globalization has reached the point where global economy, politics, etc., has become a regular political topic, and they began to structure the decisions of electors. That's what a cleavage is, a political conflict that kind of influences electoral decisions. And this global local conflict is becoming a central point of European politics. It's very logical because most of our political life happens on a European level, so it is only fair that it becomes a topic of a political debate.
Thank you very much. Daniel?
Well, John, I couldn't agree more about what you said about John Gray. In fact, I wrote an article on his article because I thought it was very astute. And yes, the man has changed his fundamental philosophical and political orientation 22 times since 1988. And yet there's a core of political wisdom there. And I think he's right. He says, the real problem is not populism, it's an extreme technocratic centrism and a liberalism that has lost touch with old-fashioned liberal democracy, or as has been said, it's the people from nowhere with their deep resentments of the upstart people from somewhere. Look, the National Rally may have begun as an anti-Gaullist force. It certainly did. But the title Rassemblement National is a Gaullist title. Rassemblement pour le peuple français. The Gaulls party begun in 47. The idea was a rally of the people, above the ideologists, above left, right, above the. Well, there was a technocratic side to de Gaulle. He set up the School of National Administration, made possible the so-called anarchs, and all that. But for de Gaulle, that was always tied to some idea of France, an inheritance that was broader and deeper than technocratic elitism or even liberal democracy. Where I would disagree with Esther, I don't know if I would disagree with her, I would query her. I don't really think Gaullism was ever Bonapartist. De Gaulle won elections and he never threatened fundamental free institutions. And in his great book, La France et son armée, from before World War II, he attacks de Gaulle for severing greatness from moderation. Greatness is a great thing, but greatness needs moderation. The Germans and Napoleon severed the two. Really important for understanding de Gaulle. But the problem is the so-called Gaullists in France, the more neo they became with each political reincarnation, the neo Gaullists, the less they spoke of the nation, the less they represented ordinary people, the people from somewhere, the more they upheld a European vision that was, in truth, very estranged from de Gaulle. So I think John Gray's basic framework, it in its own way diabolizes the patriotic and national and Eurosceptical movements in Europe, because it says these guys are really, it's a desperate and sometimes awkward effort to recover democracy. And the left everywhere now, in America, the Saving Democracy movement, which I think has just been decapitated by the Supreme Court. You can't have lawfare endlessly. In Europe, the idea of democracy is not about self-government. It's about a set of nostrums, elite nostrums that are post-political, post-national, post-liberal. And if you don't accept them, you're not a Democrat. And if you accept them and impose them coercively, like the liberal left is attempted to do in Poland, then you're a Democrat. So we have a kind of European civil war, not bloody, not with the guns, but what's the meaning of democracy? And again, however awkward and populist and uncomfortable with governing the national forces are, they are at least appealing to the people from somewhere's right to have a say in their own self-governance. And that, I think, is the heart of the matter.
Daniel. And finally, Anne-Elizabeth, this is you get to close the proceedings.
Dear Lord. Well, first of all, I'd like to say that thank you for inviting me, because it's always nice and fun to do these podcasts, seminars, things. But mostly, I would like to say that right now we have no idea what's going to come out of the elections, because the variables are incredibly difficult. It's not just that you've had already 160 triangular elections that were predictable among the 330 on Sunday night that have vanished because people have stepped down, and that changes in every place. It changes the match to basically 1 against 1. And it's a question is, who do people want to vote? Because if you read what the people who stepped down say, it is, I do not want the National Rally to get in. But do they own their voters? And we do not know that they own their voters. And we know that there's great will in the country to bloody the nose of Emmanuel Macron. Emmanuel Macron apparently is going about the place these days saying it, it is all as I predicted, and I will have saved the country from fascism. Now, we do not know what the result is on Sunday night, but what we do know is that if there's one thing that the French do not want to see, it's a happy, proud of himself Emmanuel Macron. I get feedback from the countryside, from various friends who are running for different parties, and they all join together in saying, you have no clue how much the man is rejected. And they use stronger words. So there's an unknown in this. On paper, the National Rally doesn't get full majority. In reality, honestly, I work with pollsters. They do not know. I do not know. None of us knows. But the answer will be interesting and very clear.
Elizabeth, Daniel, Mahoney, Esther, Seuss, thank you very much. Now some of us will reassemble on the same time, and in fact that's Esther. You and Elizabeth will be sunning yourself on a Greek Isle. Congratulations!
Yes. In Corfu.
Getting away from it all. Yeah, and I will be at a conference in Washington. Myself in the Greek Isle as well, but you take what you get.
And I will be on Rouge Jacob on left bank of Paris. So we're going all over the place.
Yes, good. Thank you all very much. I look forward to convening you again. We'll do so from this end, and I look forward to that discussion as well. But thank you, extremely stimulating and very, I would say, almost a panoramic discussion of French life and ideas. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, John.
Thank you.
Thank you.